Karibuni to this Elephant Cast. We are talking Liberia and elections with Dr. Robtel Pailey. Elections, Liberia. We all seem to be a little bit confused about what's going on because it seems that Liberia has been doing elections for months and months and months and there doesn't seem to be an end on sight. So could you give us some context? What is happening?
Okay, so Liberia had its third legislative and presidential post-war elections on October 10, 2017. And the House elections relatively went off without a glitch. I mean, there were some issues here and there with some House candidates claiming that there were some irregularities and voter procedural errors, and so much so that they actually brought those claims forward to the National Elections Commission. But I think for the most part, those claims have been resolved. The sticking point is the presidential elections. So 20 candidates in a country of 4.5 million. 20 candidates have now whittled down to 2 because they were not able. Constitutional Liberia says that you have to have 50 plus 1% of the vote in order to be declared a definitive winner in the presidential race. So because there were so many candidates, a lot of the votes got split. And the runoff is supposed to take place on November 7th, 2017. And the runoff purportedly was supposed to be between the current vice president of the Unity Party, Joseph Boakai, who's a part of the ruling party, and George Weah, the football star turned politician that everybody's excited about, right? The populist favorite.
He ran against the president last.
He did. He ran against President Sirleaf in 2005 and then lost in the runoff. In 2011, he ran, but as a vice presidential candidate, and someone else ran on his ticket as a presidential candidate. So after October 10th, there were a series of allegations by the third runner-up, Charles Brumskin, who is a member of the Liberty Party, and he alleged that the National Elections Commission engaged in gross irregularities and voter procedural errors. And those errors run the gamut, right? So they talked about the fact that the voter registration roll that should have been made public was not made public. It was only disseminated to the political parties, but then there's a discrepancy between what the voter registration roll that was given to the political parties and the one that the National Elections Commission actually used. There were a number of people who entered the polls and didn't have their names on the voter registration roll, so they were disenfranchised and turned away and eventually not able to vote. There were some people who were not on the list but were able to vote. So the question is, how do they decide who to allow to vote and who not to allow to vote? Another issue that came up in terms of the irregularities is that if you typed in the voter ID number for any particular candidate or any particular person or citizen or electorate, there were 2 or 3 names that would come up for one voter ID number. So all of these issues compounded into this alleged claim.
In Kenya, we call them illegalities and irregularities.
Okay, illegalities and irregularities. So Charles Brumskin, after the final results were tallied and announced on October the 20th, brought a case forward to the National Elections Commission and said there has to be a rerun because there were too many. It didn't meet the minimal standards of electoral processes. And of course, the NEC, the National Elections Commission, sort of swept the case under the rug and continued the preparation for the runoff. Charles Brumskin decided to take this to the Supreme Court. So he appealed the NEC's decision not to investigate the claims. And then the Supreme Court, surprisingly, and I think it had a lot to do with the Kenyan Supreme Court's decision to annul the elections and ask for a rerun, the Supreme Court forced the NEC to investigate the claims that had been made by Charles Brumskin's Liberty Party. They did the investigation and unsurprisingly decided that the claims were illegitimate, right? So they were ruling in their own favor. Charles Brumskin took the case to the Board of Commissioners of the NEC, which is the highest body of the NEC. They also ruled in their own favor and said the NEC, implemented the elections relatively well, right? And the claims were illegitimate.
May have been some problems,
yes, but not enough to warrant a rerun. So now Charles Brumskin takes the case to the Supreme Court in an appeal. And December 7th, the Supreme Court is supposed to make a decision. We're not really sure what that decision will be.
And part of the reason we don't want to have the conversation after the decision is because once that happens, we all focus on the decision. Yeah. And what I'm really, really interested in is how Liberia got to this place. One, because, Supreme Court decisions, this year in Africa, we're waking up to the fact that the Supreme Court can actually overturn an election result at the presidential level.
Sure.
And that, I think, is getting us to do a whole lot of thinking.
Sure.
But also because I think for many of us, when we think about Liberia, in our minds, we feel, well, Liberia had issues. We know that they did. And those are over. And then we all celebrated. Liberia has Africa's, it's made history in Africa. And then now we're like, what exactly is going on?
Sure.
So I want to take you back.
Sure.
And if you can just walk me back briefly through the political history
Sure.
of Liberia.
Sure.
And how that then brings us to this moment.
So Liberia was founded, and I always put in quotation marks, by Black migrants from different parts of the world. So there were Black migrants who came from the United States, many of whom were freed men and women. But some of them were also manumitted slaves. So they were given their freedom on the condition that they would leave the United States and come to Liberia to settle. Liberia was also founded, in quotation marks, by Black migrants from the Caribbean. So, for instance, there are Liberians like me who have ancestry that they can trace to Jamaica and Barbados and Trinidad and so forth and so on. Liberia was also founded by Black migrants from the Congo River Basin who were on their way as captives across the Atlantic and then recaptived and then sent back to Liberia to settle. So it's really the first, Africa's first Black republic. But as is the case of human history, usually when a country is founded or a territory is founded, there are always people in that territory. So those settlers found 16 ethnic groups that had migrated from other parts of West Africa and had settled in this territory that we called Liberia. Some of them lived on the coast, some of them lived in the hinterlands. So as a result, Liberia's also always had this sort of tense-filled political system in which inequality reigned supreme. So you have descendants of settlers ruling the country for hundreds of years, decades, to the point where by 1980, after the Chuwick Party, the sort of hegemonic party has ruled all these years, you have a coup by Samuel Kanyando, who becomes the first indigenous president of Liberia. Now,
indigenous meaning that his ancestors trace back to
those 16 ethnic groups that were already in this, or sort of occupied this territory. And he kills off the president, and he is alleged to have instituted an election in 1985 that was severely rigged, right? And many people trace Liberia's political turmoil to that 1985 elections because it was clear that he didn't win. So he wins, and then 9 years later, Charles Taylor, who gets into sort of a political rift with him because Charles Taylor worked for the Doe regime, and he was accused of embezzling funds of, I think, about $1 million from the General Services Agency. He flees to the United States, comes back about 4 years later and invades Liberia through Ivory Coast, starts a 14-year armed conflict that's protracted for a long period of time, and then eventually becomes president himself in a 1997 elections that's claimed by the international community to be free and fair. He wins by a large margin, and guess who his opponent is? Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who's been in politics in Liberia, former Minister of Finance, worked in a number of different posts in the government for a number of years. So she loses.
This is in, wow, okay. So
this is in 1997.
Okay.
Yeah, so she loses miserably. I think he wins by like 80%.
And this is the election after there's been the war.
Yes, this is the first post-war election after the war.
And this is when you have that famous slogan.
He killed my mom, he killed my pa, but I'll still vote for him.
Okay.
So he wins, and then I think Sirleaf at that point is exiled. She eventually comes back and works for the Governance Commission. But Charles Taylor he's not just comfortable ruling Liberia with an iron fist. He gets involved in Sierra Leone's armed conflict by trading, diamonds for arms. And then the Special Court for Sierra Leone indicts him on crimes of humanity for his involvement in the Sierra Leonean conflict, not his involvement in the Liberian conflict. So he's eventually indicted, prosecuted, sent to the Hague, and he ends up in a British prison for 50 years.
So he's found guilty at the international
He's found guilty, yeah. While all of this is happening, President Sirleaf, or Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, becomes a contender in the 2005 elections. So this is the first post-war election after Charles Taylor leaves in 2003, and she wins. Unprecedented that a woman becomes the first female head of state in the continent of Africa, but not just any woman, a woman who's worked for the UN and the World Bank, has, political clout, a lot of influences outside of the country. And so there's all this sort of euphoria about how she's going to completely transform the country.
So she comes into office with a lot of goodwill as well.
She does. International goodwill as well as domestic goodwill. Even though people accuse her of being involved in some of the political maneuverings that create the war in the first place. So yeah, so that's where we are. 2005, she wins in a runoff against George Weah. 2011, she wins in a runoff against George Weah's, candidate. So 2017 was supposed to really mark the first time in 74 years, because the last time we had a transition of presidential power was in 1944. All of our presidents for the past three, Sirleaf's predecessors, have either died in office or were assassinated in office, or they end up in a British prison in the case of Charles Taylor. So this, there's all this sort of anticipation that this would be the first time where one president transfers power to another president in a democratic election. So I think that's why the stakes are incredibly high. That's why everybody's waiting with bated breath, a bit anxious about what the Supreme Court is going to decide, because it could make or break that sort of blissful electoral history that we want to build for the future.
So it is really incredibly important to people that it's not just about who becomes president, but it is a way of also saying our institutions.
Absolutely. That our democracy is getting consolidated, that we are building a democracy for the future that will withstand the test of time. And
the two top candidates in this runoff, if we hadn't gone to this Supreme Court challenge, would have been George Weah, and the second candidate
is the current vice president, Sirleaf's vice president, Joseph Boakai. So he's running on the ruling party ticket.
And he's been part of Liberian politics for a while as well?
Yeah, I mean, not as much as Sirleaf has. He's been the Minister of Agriculture and then served in other posts in the government, but hasn't been at the forefront in the way that Sirleaf has.
Okay. So I want to just talk a little bit about the Supreme Court
in
Liberia. So presumably this is a new Supreme Court in the sense that after the war, all institutions were being built up.
Sure, right? From scratch.
So could you tell us a little bit more about, what do people think of the Supreme Court?
Sure.
Is it an institution? Is the judiciary an institution that Liberians have a lot of faith in?
Definitely.
Where is that coming from?
Liberians don't have very much faith in the judiciary. Liberians believe effectively. I mean, there's this term in scholarship called forum shopping that basically means people will go to a court or a system of governance or a system of sort of legality that gives them the most favorable outcome. And for most poor people, which is probably 50% of the population live under the poverty line, they don't trust the courts because the courts are incredibly corrupt. I mean, you can bribe your way through the courts, and that's something that Sirleaf she's been trying to build for the past 12 years, hasn't done a very good job. So the fact that she has handpicked all of the justices of the Supreme Court, she's appointed all of them, many people feel that they're already compromised because they're not independent, quote unquote, they're not independent. But I think the fact that they forced the National Elections Commission to investigate the claims is a way of them sort of exerting their clout and saying, yes, we were appointed by this woman, but we still have a certain level of judicial independence. It could swing either way. I don't think the jury is certainly not out. I think there's a 50-50 chance that they could say, no, we're going to have a rerun, which would complicate a lot of things for Liberia because where are we going to get the money? There's also a 50-50 chance that they could say, clean up the processes. If there are any irregularities that we observed in the October 10 race, clean up the processes, clean up the voter registration roll, and let's prepare for the runoff. If there's no runoff, there could be a constitutional quagmire. So Sirleaf is supposed to leave office the third week of January in 2018. And if she doesn't leave office, there isn't that peaceful transition of power. The Speaker of the House becomes the effective head of state. And I think President Sirleaf doesn't want that because her legacy is on the line, right? Yes. She was supposed to steer the course of the country's history and make sure that there is a peaceful transition.
And if she can leave and say, I served my term with no problem.
And I'm stepping away without any issues.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we actually look at three institutions. There's the executive, which is the presidency.
Yeah.
And there are issues there. Because now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I seem to have read somewhere that the ruling party is actually, was at least at one point in agreement with the challenger to the Supreme Court, and they were actually saying that the election commission, the government seems to have sided, and so they seem to be agreeing with that, which I found very interesting. So we have the executive, and we're looking at that. We're also looking at the judiciary, and then we're also looking at the electoral commission. Have there been problems before this with the electoral commission through the period that it has been serving?
Absolutely. So a lot of people point to the fact that the issues with the NEC are not new. There were a number of questions around their level of independence. So for instance, the National Elections Commission is headed by one Jerome Kokria. He's a lawyer. But there was an expose in one of the local dailies about the fact that he has U.S. citizenship. Now, by law, Liberia doesn't recognize or sanction dual citizenship. So if he does have U.S. citizenship, he's actually not in a position to actually run effectively an election, or he's not even supposed to be the NEC chair. So that was one. Another issue that came up is that in 2014, the House and the Senate passed a 2014 Civil Service Conduct Bill. And the Civil Service Conduct Act basically says that if you intend to run for an elected post, if you are in the executive branch, you have to resign 2 years before the actual elections, which means that anybody who ran in the October 2017 race should have resigned by October or September 2015. Many of those who ended up eventually running did not resign. They did not resign their post in time. And the National Elections Commission allowed them to become legitimate candidates. So the question is, the enforcement of that particular act was pretty clear in the law, and they disregarded that enforcement, and they didn't enforce that. So lots of questions about whether or not the NEC has actually enforced a lot of the laws that we've been able to develop in the past 12 years. And the question is, they haven't, or the answer is they certainly haven't. And so their legitimacy is on the line, even before these claims being made by Charles Brumskin came to the fore.
One of the things that I'm getting very interested, even here in Kenya, is that often we focus on the personalities, but then we also have to talk about institutions, and we have to talk about this question of legitimacy, so that elections are legitimate if people trust the institutions. And it sounds to me that you're saying, look, one of the things we have to pay attention to is what's going on in the judiciary, the independence of the judiciary, and also the independence and what's going on in the Electoral Commission. On the other hand, you also have to take into account that these are very young institutions. You're saying 12 years. You have to ask yourself, are we expecting too much? What do you think? I mean, should we cut some slack and say, look, they've run an election. There are issues, yes, but they've run an election.
No, I don't think we should cut them any slack. And the reason I say that is because we're at this sort of infancy stage, this is when we get it right? If I look at other electoral processes across the continent that are much more developed and matured, we get so mired in illegitimate practices that it's difficult for us to go back. But Liberia is starting from scratch. So for me, as a scholar, as an academic, as a Liberian citizen, I would expect that we want to get it right from the very beginning, so we don't continue to reproduce the same kinds of illegitimate practices that eventually end up in a Kenya scenario, right? So I don't believe in cutting anyone slack. I think we need to practice, we need to implement the rule of law. The laws are pretty clear. It's not about interpretation. They're pretty, like that 2014 Code of Conduct, you have to resign 2 years before you run.
Either you've resigned or you haven't.
Or you haven't. And there's some people who actually did it. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, even though he eventually decided not to run, he resigned 2 years before, in fact, more than 2 years before the elections, because he had political ambitions to run for presidency. So if he can follow the law, then why can't everybody else? Why can't the House candidates follow the law?
So what the NEC should have done is at the point
enforced.
To say you cannot run because you did not resign.
Enforced. Okay. We should have enforced those laws. And I think it's about, and I mentioned, in a previous interview with you, that Liberia has lots of wonderful policies. We have lots of wonderful regulations, but we don't enforce them. And it's not just unique to Liberia, it's across the continent. So what's the point of creating policies and rules and regulations if we're not going to enforce them, especially if they're so clear cut?
So you don't believe
I don't believe,
we are
no.
growing and one day we're going to get there?
I think we need to get it right from the very beginning. And that's the thing about post-war countries, is that we're not starting from scratch, because obviously there's no country that's tabula rasa, even if they're coming out of a 14-year armed conflict. But we are starting from a position where we do have the ability to really set the pace. And the only way to set the pace is to set it right from the very beginning. Mm-hmm. So I think post-elections, after this stalemate is resolved, lots of legal scholars, activists, civil society activists are going to be asking questions about how do we reform our electoral law so that these enforcement problems are resolved in the next elections. But we need to get it right.
Looking at, we said, okay, it's 14 years. So in that sense, it's very young. But then at the same time, Liberia is one of the few African countries who can talk about a really, really long history. Yeah. And you were talking, and I kept thinking, you've had this I know, President Tolbert, then you talked about the Master Sergeant, President Doe, then there's Doe to Taylor, and then Taylor to Johnson.
Yeah.
Are there things that you can say, even through the years of war or looking back now, this is the trajectory I have seen, and these are the lessons that I think have been useful, that even now when we're talking about this particular moment, these are useful lessons for us to reflect on, because I think many of us look at either very relatively short history, but also I think there's a lot of fear. I know in Kenya, one of my fears is if we go into war, so sometimes we will say, look, it's peace at any price. I don't even care if I know this election is fraudulent, and it may not be at the presidency, maybe even at lower levels, as long as we don't go into war.
Well, it's so interesting that you've asked that question, because I did a lecture at Strathmore Law School, and it was about looking at Liberia's electoral history, looking at it from a historical trajectory, but then also comparing the recent electoral litigation processes in Liberia and comparing what happened in Kenya. And one of the students raised her hand at the end of the lecture and said, well, isn't political expediency the convenience, right, to make sure that we don't go into a 14-year protracted armed conflict so that we abate any sort of crisis or destabilizing effects? Isn't that better than doing a rerun that could possibly create lots of tension and problems and violence? And I said to her, let me go back to the example that I gave of the 1985 elections. In Liberia's history, we are known in the Guinness Book of World Records as having the first recorded rigged election. That was in 1927. Yeah. So 1985 follows suit by that being the second most rigged election. And as I said earlier, if that election had not been rigged, if we had done a rerun or the process had been free and fair, I don't think we would have had a 14-year armed conflict. I don't think we would probably be having this sort of conversation about, the dilemma of whether or not the Supreme Court should rule in the opposition's favor or continue with the runoff. I think if there's the scholar that says, elections are important, but they're not the be all and end all of democracy. But if elections are properly run, they can enhance democratic consolidation. But if there's voter procedural error, if there are illegalities and irregularities, they tend to destabilize a country. And we can see that from Liberia. So my response to the young student was, Kenya doesn't want a 14-year protracted armed conflict. You want to get the elections right. You don't want just, there's a Kenyan activist and political analyst by the name of Nanjala Nyambola, and she wrote a really great piece in Al Jazeera, and she said, we don't want just good enough elections. We want good elections, solid elections that we can say are legitimate. Because if we don't have that, you have a 1985 scenario that does destabilize an entire country for a long period of time. And I can say it's easy to destroy, but it takes so much effort, so much resource, funding to build back up. So for me, it's not about political expediency. It's not about convenience. It's not about letting sleeping dogs lie. It's about holding people accountable, making sure that our systems and our institutions function properly.
Well, another argument, if I can push back a bit, is that it's very expensive. Elections come at a cost.
Yep.
And I'm thinking both of the cost of the actual election, so that somehow you must find money to run the elections, but also that economies take a beating. A lot of people, I know here in Kenya, there's been a lot of, we can't invest because we're waiting to see. We now call it a Kenyan proverb. Let's see how the elections will go. And in that period, people have lost jobs. I mean, people who are casual workers, we have a whole period where we're doing nothing but waiting. And so it's a very expensive thing to do. For those who are worried about the economy, what would you say? Maybe, sometimes people will say, look, we've learned a lesson and next time we're not going to do this. So we're going to make it more difficult for the next election for this to happen. What would you say to that?
Well, I will basically borrow from a Liberian legal scholar who used to serve as the deputy auditor or the deputy attorney general of Liberia, the deputy minister of Liberia. And Tiawan Gonglo, who is somebody that I really respect because he comes from a civil society activist background. And he said in a piece that was published in one of the local dailies, armed conflict is more expensive than doing a rerun. That's his response. It's a very ideological response, but I subscribe to that because look what the war cost Liberia, not only in terms of finances, but in terms of the human capital, the potential, the amount of people who died. 250,000 people perished as a result of that armed conflict, as a result of the 1985 elections that were rigged. millions of people displaced. I mean, thousands upon thousands of Liberians are refugees in other parts of West Africa, in the United States, in the UK. So armed conflict, what comes out, a function of these sort of illegalities and irregularities, is armed conflict, political turmoil, political tension, more expensive than doing a rerun. So I know it doesn't really answer your question practically, but I really believe that that's something that we need to think about. We've already experienced it. We don't want other countries to follow in our stead. So I think if it means doing a rerun, we just have to find the resources. And something that I always say, Mshai, to everybody, Liberia is not poor. We might be a post-war country. Our problem is that we're poorly managed. We have the resources. We have the natural resources. We have the goodwill of the international community. We just squandered. We've squandered through theft, through corruption, through everything under the sun, to the point where we cannot even, we don't have the position, we don't have the capacity to fund our own elections. And that's another story altogether. The fact that a lot of elections on the continent are funded externally. So it even delegitimizes the processes if we have other people funding our elections, right? What's the phrase? Who pays the piper is the one who sings the tune, who determines what tune you're singing. Yeah.
So you said you were speaking on, you were comparing the Supreme Court process here and the one in Liberia.
Yeah.
Could you offer some thoughts, just some quick thoughts on
what
you're thinking?
Sure. So in terms of, I was comparing the level of judicial independence of the Liberian Supreme Court to the Kenyan Supreme Court. And from what I remember, the Kenyan Supreme Court through the 2010 Constitution, they're not appointed by the president per se, directly by the president.
Yes.
Which gives them a certain level of judicial independence that the Liberian Supreme Court doesn't have, because the Liberian Supreme Court is directly, the whole Supreme Court bench is directly appointed by the president. So a lot of people in Liberia will say, well, the president can influence.
At least, yes.
She can influence. The other thing that's interesting, if you compare the two electoral litigation processes, is when Raila brought forward these claims of illegalities and irregularities, I believe he went straight to the Supreme Court. He didn't go through the IEBC.
No.
In the case of Liberia, the irony is that the National Elections Commission adjudicates its own cases. So when Charles Brumskin of the Liberty Party had these, alleged claims against them, they had to investigate their own claims against them and then rule.
Saying, no, we're not.
Yeah, of course. I mean, who would take the blame for massive, gross fraud that this man is claiming? So much so that the process has been prolonged because he had to go through the Supreme Court. He had to go through the National Elections Commission and then the Board of Commissioners appeal. And now he's just going to the Supreme Court to appeal. So a lot of us are looking at the Kenya example and saying we have to change our laws in such a way that if there are any electoral disputes, you go straight to the Supreme Court. And if we had done that, the decision would have been made by now. The Supreme Court would have done its own internal investigation, and we would have known whether or not we'd be doing a rerun or a runoff much earlier on. So
it has really dragged.
It's dragged the process on. And because the National Elections Commission did not investigate those claims from the very beginning, because they don't want to take full responsibility of the alleged claims against them. So there's a contradiction in allowing them to adjudicate a case against them. That contradiction does not exist in Kenya. So as you can see, we're looking to Kenya as an example of what we could do better in the future.
One of the things I really like is that there seems to be something happening all over the continent. We're talking now, but we're all thinking, we're talking about Liberia and Kenya, but we're thinking about Zimbabwe. Yeah. We're looking at what's going on in South Africa.
Absolutely.
We've been looking at Somaliland.
Sure.
So there are a number of elections that I think are helping us as Africans to think through what it means to have elections and democracy.
Sure.
I wonder if you could offer some thoughts as we come to an end on what are some of the lessons do you think that this political moment and the political processes that we're going through as a continent, as we look at each other, as we learn from each other, what are some of the lessons that you think are beginning to emerge?
Well, I think part of it is, this lesson about what does democracy mean for us? Is it something that we cut and paste from the West? Is it something that we import? Is it something that we create sort of organically through our own processes? And I think another thing that, for me, at least, that it's raised is that democracy is not an event, it's a process, right? And democracy, for me, there are two elements of democracy. It's the sort of the processes, right? So the elections being an example of the processes, but also the institutions, right? So the foundation of that is an independent judiciary. an independent media, an independent civil society, an independent legislature, parliament. Those are the elements that bring the sort of deliberation, political conversations that create a sort of democratic process and a democratic consolidation process. So I think we just have to remember that we can create a democracy that is germane to the continent, that's organic and parcel of who we are as Africans, who we are as sort of a continental body, that we don't have to pick and choose, because the West, their democracy is absolutely flawed. So we shouldn't take their example and cut and paste it and foist it upon ourselves. But we need to create. And part of that is trial and error. That's why when you said the fact that, you know, the Kenya example and the Liberia example will teach other countries how to do it better.
We're part of this global discourse.
We are.
How do we make ourselves into a better world?
Absolutely.
One last thought is I want us to think about nation. I'm really interested in this concept of nation, growing, nurturing, if you want, becoming a nation, as opposed to just, you know, this thing that's created. And it struck me how different our histories are, and yet how similar. So both of us are dealing with peoples who are put in a space and then told, okay, you now are all Kenyans, or you're now Liberians, or whatever you are. And this tension in how do we become one person. And I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts about this journey towards becoming one people, becoming a nation with all our diverse identities and communities that we find ourselves being.
So I'll give you an example from my research, right? So unlike Kenya, what's interesting is that Liberia was never formally colonized. I mean, there are scholars who say that it suffered from black settler colonialism. It's a can of worms that I'm not going to open right now. But what's interesting about the fact that Liberia was not formally colonized by European powers is that our common enemy was each other. So throughout Liberia's history, there's always been this tension between the settler versus the indigene. Now it's those who are coming back as returnees from other places who left during the course of the war, and those who remain. So it's like a replication of that 1847 encounter between the indigenous and the settler. But what happened, you know, interestingly enough, is that we had Ebola, right? And for the first time in Liberia's 170-year history, our common enemy was outside of ourselves. We were fighting Ebola as a crisis that threatened to completely obliterate the population in the country. And every Liberian, those in the country, outside of the country, rallied around this cause to fight Ebola. And I think that's when our process of nation making and nation building actually started. In 2014, 2015, after 100 years plus of being a quote unquote nation, a state. So I think, you know, there are different ways in which nation making takes place. There are different ways in which nation building takes place. And I think the key to that is to really minimize the level of inequality that you find in a particular society. I think that's when you start to create national cohesion. I think there's a really famous quote in Chimamanda's book about her feminist manifesto where she says, when inequality is lessened, resentment will be lessened, or something like that. I know I'm butchering it, but basically where inequality doesn't exist, there will be less, resentment will not thrive, or something like that. And I think that speaks to not only just a partnership between a man and a wife, or a partnership that sort of breeds children, but also a nation, right? Where inequality does not exist, resentment will not thrive. And I think that's how you build a nation, is you level the playing field in a way that everybody feels like they have a stake in that nation building process. So when we started fighting against Ebola, that's when we started building that nation in Liberia after 170 years of existence.
Wow, you've given us so much to think about. And we wish Liberia all the best. We will be watching and learning as fellow Africans. But I just want to say thank you so much. You've given us a lot to think about.
Thank you for having me, Michelle.
This has been an Elephant Cast where we've been talking about democracy and elections and Supreme Court judgments through the lens of Liberia. We hope you've enjoyed it.